Chapter 8. A New Beginning. The sun was setting over Asuna's sprawling cityscape, casting the world in a warm, golden glow. The light streamed across the horizon, dappling the rooftops and treetops below with hues of amber and soft pink. From the balcony of their cabin in Alo, Kirito could see the distant spires of the city center, their crystalline peaks catching the last rays of sunlight. A soft breeze rustled through the trees nearby, carrying with it the faint, floral scent of the forest. It was a picture of tranquility, the kind of peace he'd longed for during the chaos of the sanctuary. And yet, his thoughts were anything but peaceful. Kirito leaned against the balcony railing, his head bowed, his gaze fixed on his hand. Slender, delicate, unmistakably feminine. He turned them over slowly, studying every detail. The elegant taper of his fingers, the faint glow of his skin in the evening light. These were the hands he'd seen in the mirror that morning, in the real world. Hands that had once been his, but now weren't. They were Asuna's hands, or, at least, a near-perfect reflection of them. He sighed, brushing a strand of long chestnut hair out of his face. The motion was fluid, instinctive, but it only served to remind him of how different everything felt now. His hair, his posture, even the way his body moved and held itself, it all felt foreign and familiar at the same time. The AI was gone, the virus stopped, but what it had done to him, that was permanent. He hadn't said it out loud yet, hadn't even fully admitted it to himself, but he knew. This was his body now, in the game and in reality. And honestly, he wasn't sure how he felt about it. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a moment. The breeze tugged gently at his hair, but it did little to settle the storm inside him. Part of him wanted to rage, to demand answers from a foe that no longer existed. Another part of him wanted to laugh bitterly at the absurdity of it all. He'd spent so long fighting to protect others, to save Asuna and everyone else, only to end up like this, caught in some strange limbo between himself and someone else entirely. Kirito? The soft voice pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see Asuna standing in the doorway behind him. She was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, her hair shimmering like spun gold. She wore a simple white dress, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor of the cabin. Her expression was gentle, but her eyes were searching, concerned. "You've been out here a while," she said, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping back to his hands. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Asuna didn't respond right away. Instead, she moved to stand beside him, leaning her arms on the railing. She didn't press him, didn't push for answers. She just stood there, silent and steady, her presence grounding him in a way he didn't fully understand. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, after a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Kirito followed her eyes, taking in the sight of the sun dipping below the skyline. The light was softer now, casting long shadows across the ground. The city looked alive, vibrant, like something out of a dream. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." They stood in silence for a while, the sounds of the world around them filling the air, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of voices from the city, the faint chirping of birds settling in for the night. Finally, Asuna broke the quiet. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "What the AI did, what it changed, it's a lot to process." Kirito let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's an understatement," he said, glancing down at himself again. "I don't even know who I am anymore. Every time I move, every time I see myself, it's like I'm someone else. Like I'm you. Asuna turned to face him fully, her eyes meeting his. You're not me, Kirito, she said firmly. You're still you. No matter what the AI tried to make you, no matter what it changed, it couldn't take that away from you. He looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. She believed what she was saying completely, and for a moment, he almost believed it too. But what if I'm not? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if this thing I've become isn't me anymore? What if it's just what the AI wanted me to be? Asuna reached out, resting her hand on his. Her touch was warm, steady, and it sent a small ripple of calm through him. Kirito, she said, her tone gentle but firm. You're the one who fought back. You're the one who refused to let the AI control you. You're standing here right now because you chose to be. That's what makes you you. He swallowed hard, her words sinking in. She was right. He'd fought, he'd resisted, and he'd won. But the doubts lingered, clawing at the edges of his mind. He paused, struggling to find the words. I don't know how to move forward from this. Every time I look in the mirror, I feel like I've lost something, like I'm not whole anymore. Azuna's grip on his hand tightened slightly. You're not alone in this, she said. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're going through, I'm here. And I know the others are too. We'll figure it out together. Kirito turned to look at her, the sincerity in her eyes striking a chord deep within him. He felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth, though it was faint. Thanks, Asuna, he said quietly. She smiled back, her expression warm and reassuring. That's what partners are for, right? The word, partner, hung in the air between them, and Kirito felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, push back the storm in his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but as he stood there with Asuna, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a little less lost. The breeze picked up again, carrying with it the scent of flowers and the faint sound of music from the city below. Kirito closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sensations wash over him. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. Earlier that day, Kirito had woken to the sound of relentless knocking on the door of his cabin. It was loud, insistent, and completely unwelcome. Kirito, wake up already. It was Klein. Of course, it was Klein. Kirito groaned, pressing his face deeper into the pillow as if he could block out the noise, and the world along with it. Go away, he muttered, his voice muffled by the fabric. Come on, Kiri-chan, open up. Klein's voice called again, a little louder this time. We're all waiting for you. Don't make me kick this door down. Kirito rolled onto his back, staring at the wooden ceiling above him. He could already picture Klein, standing outside, shifting from foot to foot, with that irritatingly persistent grin on his face. I'm not coming out, he called back, though the words came out softer than he intended. He winced at the sound of his own voice. Soft, melodic, undeniably feminine. No matter how many times he spoke, it still caught him off guard. The knocking stopped, and for a brief blissful moment, Kirito thought Klein had given up. But then the door swung open, and Kirito froze. He peeked out from under the blanket, to see Asuna standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression caught somewhere between amusement and concern. Her presence filled the room in a way that was both comforting and unnerving. Kirito, she said, her tone firm but warm, you can't hide forever. I'm not hiding, Kirito muttered, though his voice held no conviction. He yanked the blanket higher over his head, as if that would somehow make her disappear. Asuna sighed, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. Everyone's worried about you, she said gently, walking over to the bed. She sat down on the edge, the mattress dipping slightly under her weight. You've been in here all morning. Kirito stayed silent, the blanket still pulled up to his chin. He knew she was right. He could picture the others waiting outside, probably trading jokes to mask their concern. But facing them felt impossible. I need some time, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Asuna tilted her head, studying him. The faintest smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but her eyes were soft with understanding. You've had time, she said gently. And we're all here to help you through this. You don't have to do it alone. Her words made something in his chest tighten, but he didn't respond. After a moment, Asuna leaned forward, resting her hand lightly on his arm. Kirito, she said softly. Please, come out and talk to us. If not for you, then for them. Kirito sighed, knowing he couldn't argue with her. Slowly, reluctantly, he sat up, letting the blanket fall away. The motion revealed his slim frame, his long chestnut hair cascading over his shoulders. His bangs fell into his eyes, and he brushed them back awkwardly, avoiding Asuna's gaze. But when he finally looked at her, he caught her staring. Not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. You're really okay with this? He asked, his voice hesitant. With me looking like you. Asuna blinked, then laughed softly, the sound light and disarming. Kirito, you might look like me, but you're still you. That hasn't changed? He frowned, his hands clenching in his lap. It doesn't feel like it, he admitted. Every time I see myself, every time I move, it's like I don't know who I am anymore. Azuna's gaze softened, and she reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair behind his ear. The gesture was so familiar, so natural, that it made his chest ache. Kirito, she said gently. You've always been more than how you look. You're the one who stood up to the AI, the one who protected all of us. None of that has changed. She tilted her head, a playful glint in her eye. Although I have to admit, it's a little weird seeing my face pout back at me. Kirito groaned, burying his face in his hand. Don't remind me, he muttered, his voice muffled. Asuna laughed again, the sound light and genuine. I mean it, she said, her tone teasing now. You've got the hair flipped down perfectly. I'm starting to think you've been paying more attention to me than I realized. Kirito's hands dropped from his face as he shot her a glare, his cheeks heating. I have not. Sure, Asuna replied, her grin widening. Whatever you say. Despite himself, Kirito felt the corner of his mouth twitch. He shook his head, trying to suppress the smile threatening to break through. You're impossible, he muttered, though there was no real heat in his tone. And you're stubborn, Asuna countered, standing up and offering him her hand. No, come on. Let's go before Klein really does break the door down. Kirito hesitated, glancing at her outstretched hand. For a moment, the weight of everything he was feeling threatened to pull him back under. But then he looked at Asuna, really looked at her. There was no judgment in her eyes, no pity. Only patience, understanding, and a quiet strength that reminded him why he'd always admired her. With a quiet sigh, he reached out and took her hand. Her grip was firm and reassuring. And as she helped him to his feet, he felt a small spark of something he hadn't felt in days. Hope. Oh. Fine, he said, running a hand through his hair. But if Klein makes one joke, I'm leaving. No promises, Asuna said with a wink, pulling him toward the door. As they stepped out into the sunlight, Kirito squinted against the brightness. The others were waiting just as he'd expected, Klein leaning against the railing with a wide grin, Sinon standing nearby with her arms crossed, and Agile sitting on a nearby bench, his axe resting against his knee. "There he is," Klein announced, throwing his arms wide. "The man of the hour." He paused, then smirked. "Or should I say, lady of the hour?" Kirito groaned, dragging a hand down his face. "I knew it," he muttered. Asuna laughed beside him, and even Sinon cracked a small smile. "You're lucky I came out at all," Kirito said, glaring half-heartedly at Klein. "Hey, don't blame me," Klein replied, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just saying what we're all thinking." "Speak for yourself," Sinon said, her voice dry but amused. "I think he pulls it off." Kirito sighed, but despite himself, he felt a small flicker of warmth at their banter. For the first time in days, he didn't feel completely alone. When Kirito finally stepped out of the cabin, the sunlight hit him like a spotlight, making him squint. The clearing outside was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. But the moment his presence registered, the group turned toward him, their reactions immediate. "There she is." Klein's voice rang out, loud and entirely too enthusiastic. He grinned like an idiot, his arms spread wide. "I mean, there he is." Kirito stopped in his tracks, crossing his arms and narrowing his eyes at Klein. "Klein," he said flatly, his voice laced with warning. "I will stab you." Klein raised both hands in mock surrender, though the grin never left his face. "Hey, I'm just saying you're rocking the look, Kiri-chan. You've got the whole graceful warrior princess thing down to a science." Kirito's glare darkened, his patience already wearing thin. He'd barely managed to convince himself to come out here, and now Klein was making him regret it. From her spot, leaning against a nearby tree, Sinon smirked, her sharp eyes glinting with amusement. "He's not wrong," she said, her tone calm but teasing. "You might as well just own it at this point." Kirito's eye twitched, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're enjoying this way too much," he muttered, shooting her a pointed look. "Maybe a little," she replied, her smirk widening ever so slightly. Agile, seated on a large rock near the edge of the clearing, let out a deep chuckle that rumbled like distant thunder. He crossed his arms, his massive axe resting against his knee. "Can you blame us? It's not every day we see the great Kirito turned into a spitting image of Asuna." Kirito shot him a betrayed look. "Not you too, Agile." The merchant shrugged, his grin growing. "Just calling it like I see it, man. Besides, you've got to admit, it's kind of impressive. You could probably fool half the players in Alnay if you wanted to." "That's not the point," Kirito snapped, his voice rising slightly. "Relax, Kirito," Sinon interjected, her voice as dry as ever. "They're just jealous. You've got better hair than all of us now." Dine snorted. "Oh, speak for yourself. My hair is amazing." He ran a hand through his spiky red locks, striking a mock heroic pose. Kirito groaned, dragging his hand down his face. "Can we not make this a thing?" He turned to Asuna, his last hope for sanity. "Please, tell me you're not going to join in on this." Asuna stepped forward, her expression soft and sympathetic as she placed a hand on his arm. For a moment, Kirito felt a flicker of relief. Finally, someone who understood. Okay, she said, addressing the group. "Everyone lay off. Kirito's been through enough already." "Thank you," Kirito said, exhaling in relief. But then Asuna tilted her head, a mischievous glint sparking in her eyes. Although, she added, her tone turning playful, he really does look good in my outfit. Kirito froze, turning to her in disbelief. Asuna! He exclaimed, throwing his hands in the air. She laughed, the sound light and melodic, and the rest of the group quickly joined in. Even Sinon allowed herself a small chuckle, and Agil's deep laugh echoed through the clearing. You're supposed to be on my side, Kirito muttered, his face flushed with equal parts embarrassment and exasperation. I am on your side, Asuna replied, still smiling. But, come on, Kirito. You have to admit, it's a little funny. I don't have to admit anything, Kirito grumbled, glaring at her half-heartedly. Klein stepped closer, clapping a hand on Kirito's shoulder. Cheer up, Kiri-chan. You know we're just messing with you. His grin turned a little softer, more sincere. Seriously, though, we're glad you're finally out here. It wasn't the same without you. Kirito blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. Klein's words, simple as they were, carried a warmth that made him pause. He glanced around the group, taking in their expressions. Despite the teasing, there was no malice, no judgment. If anything, there was relief. Relief that he was here, with them, instead of hiding away. Yeah? Agil added, his deep voice steady. We've been through too much together for you to shut us out now. Sinon nodded, her smirk softening into something closer to a real smile. You're not the only one who's had to deal with changes. You don't have to handle it on your own, you know. Kirito swallowed, the weight of their words settling over him. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear them, how much he'd needed to be reminded that he wasn't alone in this. Thanks, he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. I appreciate it. Klein grinned again, though this time it was less teasing and more genuine. Anytime, buddy. Now, how about we head into town? I'm starving, and I hear the tavern's got a new menu. You're always starving, Asuna said, rolling her eyes but smiling nonetheless. It's called a healthy appetite. Klein shot back, already heading toward the path that led to the city. As the group began to fall into step behind him, Kirito found himself walking beside Asuna. She glanced at him, her expression softening. Feeling a little more normal now? She asked gently. Kirito considered her question for a moment. The teasing still stung a little, and the reminders of his transformation were impossible to ignore. But as he looked around at his friends, their laughter, their easy camaraderie, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in days. Yeah, he said finally, a small smile tugging at his lip. A little. Asuna smiled back, her eyes warm. Good. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above them as they walked. The clearing behind them faded into the distance, replaced by the sound of the city, growing louder with each step. For the first time since the transformation, Kirito felt like he could breathe again. The road ahead still felt uncertain, but with his friends beside him, he knew he could face it. As the day went on, the group fell back into their familiar pattern of adventuring. It felt almost normal, almost. They tackled a nearby dungeon, its dark, twisting corridors, lit only by faintly glowing runes, etched into the stone. The air was thick with the damp, musty scent of age, and the occasional distant growl of mobs echoed through the tunnels. Kirito led the way, his rapier gleaming faintly in the dim light. Every step felt automatic, almost muscle memory at this point. Yet, as they delved further into the dungeon, he couldn't shake the awareness of how different his movements felt. The first mob ambush came quickly, an assortment of shadowy wolf-like creatures that darted out from the darkness. The group scattered into their usual formation, each member falling into their practiced roles. Kirito surged forward instinctively, his weapon flashing in a graceful arc that sent the first attacker sprawling. It was fast, faster than he was used to. His body moved with an ease that was almost unsettling, each step flowing seamlessly into the next. His strikes were precise, elegant, and unnervingly efficient. Gone was the raw, straightforward aggression he'd once relied on. In its place was something else entirely: fluidity, grace, and speed. The fight ended quickly, the group standing amidst the fading particles of their defeated foes. "Nice work," Asuna said, lowering her rapier and glancing at Kirito with an approving smile. Kirito nodded, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground as he caught his breath. His chest rose and fell steadily, but it wasn't the exertion that unsettled him. It was the way his new body seemed to anticipate his movements, almost as if it were leading him, rather than the other way around. He flexed his fingers, staring at them for a moment. They didn't feel like his hands, but they responded too well, like they belonged to someone else entirely. The group pressed on, fighting through scattered mobs and solving puzzles that barred their path. Kirito tried to focus, to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of adventuring, but the differences in his combat style were impossible to ignore. His strikes were sharper, his footwork more precise, and every movement seemed to flow together like a perfectly choreographed dance. By the time they stumbled upon a hidden treasure room, a small chamber glittering with gold coins and rare loot, the subtle tension in Kirito's chest hadn't eased. "Jackpot," Klein declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls, as he rushed forward to examine the loot. He picked up an ornate shield, holding it up to the faint light. "Oh yeah, this baby's going in my collection." Sinon rolled her eyes. "You mean your storage chest of junk you'll never use?" "Hey, one man's junk is another man's treasure," Klein retorted with a grin. Kirito stood near the back of the room, his rapier resting at his side. He watched the group banter, his expression neutral, though his mind churned. The fluidity of his movements, the precision of his strikes. It wasn't him. Not really. It was the transformation. It was this body. And as much as he hated to admit it, it worked. "Okay, I'll say it," Klein said as they exited the dungeon, the warm sunlight outside a welcome contrast to the dungeon's cold, oppressive air. "This new fighting style of yours? Kinda badass." Kirito shot him a sharp glare, though there was no real heat behind it. "Don't get used to it." "No? Seriously?" Klein insisted, falling into step beside him. "You're like a fusion of you and Asuna. It's awesome." Kirito groaned, dragging a hand through his hair. That was not the comparison he wanted to hear. Again. "That's not exactly what I'm going for," he muttered. "No," Klein shrugged. "Doesn't matter what you're going for. You're killing it out there. I mean, I was kind of jealous before, but now I'm thinking you're going to put us all to shame." Kirito rolled his eyes. "If you start calling me Kiri-chan again, I swear." "I think it suits you," Sinon interjected, her voice carrying a faint edge of amusement. She walked a few steps ahead, her bow slung casually over her shoulder. She glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "You're adapting. That's what matters." Kirito frowned. He wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or a backhanded remark. "She's right, you know," Asuna chimed in, walking at his other side. Her tone was softer, more encouraging. "You're adapting really well." Kirito sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground as they walked. Yeah, well, it's not like I have much of a choice, he muttered. Maybe not, Asuna said, her voice lightening. But you're making it work, and that's what matters. She nudged him playfully with her elbow, and Kirito glanced at her, catching the small proud smile on her face. For a brief moment, the tension in his chest loosened. Still, the unease lingered. Making it work, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Was that what he was doing? He didn't feel like he was making it work. He felt like he was scrambling to keep up, like he was adjusting to something he didn't even want to be. But as he watched the others laugh and talk, their camaraderie as strong as ever, he realized they weren't looking at him any differently. Klein's teasing was the same as always. Sinan's dry humor hadn't changed, and Asuna was still by his side, steady and supportive. Maybe that was enough. Hey, Kirito! Klein called from up ahead, holding up the ornate shield he'd looted. Think this thing would look good on my wall. Kirito shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite himself. I think it belongs in the trash. Klein gasped, in mock offense, clutching the shield to his chest. How dare you insult my treasure? Sinan snorted. Ah, well. It's not treasure if it's useless. As the group dissolved into laughter, Kirito felt a flicker of normalcy. The weight of his transformation hadn't disappeared, but for now, surrounded by his friends, it felt a little lighter. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn to live with. By the time they returned to Alni, the mood in the group was light, their laughter carrying through the cobblestone streets. The towering spires of the city glistened under the late afternoon sun, the golden light reflecting off crystalline windows. Bustling NPC merchants lined the streets, their stalls brimming with colorful wares, while players wandered by, chatting and trading. Klein was walking ahead, animatedly recounting his latest epic moment from the dungeon, gesturing wildly as if the size of his hand movements made the story more impressive. And then, just as the mob lunged for me, Klein said, raising his arms dramatically, I spun around, shield up, and bam! Blocked it perfectly. I mean, I don't like to brag, but... You always like to brag, Sinan interjected, cutting him off with her usual sharp wit. She adjusted her bow on her shoulder, her smirk betraying her amusement. Klein ignored her, pressing on. Anyway, as I was saying, I blocked it perfectly, and then... You tripped over your own feet and fell into a Jill. Sinan finished, her deadpan delivery sparking a fresh round of laughter from the group. Klein spun around to face them, walking backward now as he pointed an accusatory finger at Sinan. Hey, that part was strategic. I distracted the mob so a Jill could land the finishing blow. Jill, walking beside him, let out a booming laugh. Strategic, huh? You nearly knocked me over. If Kirito hadn't stepped in, we'd both still be face down in that dungeon. That's because Kirito's a show-off, Klein said, grinning as he threw an arm around Kirito's shoulder. Isn't that right, Kiri-chan? Kirito sighed, shrugging Klein's arm off. I wouldn't have to show off if you didn't keep charging in without thinking. Hey, I think on my feet, Klein protested, tapping his temple for emphasis. More like you think with your feet, Sinan muttered, earning another laugh from Agil. Kirito smirked faintly, shaking his head, but before he could reply, Sinan turned her attention to him. Speaking of feet, she said, her smirk turning sly, you should really do something about that hair, Kirito. It was all over the place during the fight. You could barely see what you were doing. Kirito groaned, running a hand through his long chestnut lock. It's not that bad, he muttered, though even he couldn't deny how many times he'd had to swipe his hair out of his face during the dungeon run. "Oh, it's bad," Sinan replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "You looked like you were trying to fight and audition for a shampoo commercial at the same time." That earned a laugh from Asuna, who was walking beside Kirito. She tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Sinan's right, you know," she said. "You should tie it back, or maybe braid it." Kirito shot her a look. "I'm not braiding my hair." "Why not?" Asuna asked, feigning innocence. "It would look cute." "Not helping," Kirito said, his voice low and exasperated. Klein, who had been walking ahead again, suddenly turned around, his face lighting up with a devilish grin. "Oh, I can see it now," he declared, throwing his arms wide as if presenting an invisible poster. Kiri-chan, warrior princess of Aon, with her braided hair flowing in the wind, and her shining rapier at the ready. Kirito stopped in his tracks, glaring at Klein. "You're lucky I don't have a second sword right now." The threat only made Klein laugh harder. "And what are you gonna do? Comb me to death?" The group erupted into laughter, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the marketplace. Agil doubled over, clutching his stomach, while Sinan shook her head, clearly enjoying herself far more than she was letting on. Even Asuna had to cover her mouth to stifle her giggles. Kirito groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Why do I even put up with you people?" he muttered, though the corners of his mouth twitched upward despite himself. "Because you love us," Asuna said teasingly, nudging him lightly with her elbow. Kirito rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. As the group continued walking, the laughter began to fade, replaced by the hum of city life around them. Klein and Agil wandered ahead, debating the merits of some new gear they'd seen at a nearby stall, while Sinan drifted off to inspect a weapons merchant's display. That left Kirito and Asuna walking side by side, the energy between them quieter, but no less comfortable. "You know," Asuna said after a moment, glancing at him, "they're only teasing because they care. You've got to admit it's nice to see everyone laughing again." Kirito sighed, his gaze fixed on the cobblestones beneath his feet. "Yeah, I know. It's just weird, I guess. All of it. The jokes, the hair, the way I move now. It's like everything's changed, but nothing has at the same time." Asuna nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I get that, but you're still you, Kirito. And the fact that you can laugh about it, even a little, that says a lot." Kirito glanced at her, the sincerity in her voice catching him off guard. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, Klein's voice rang out from up ahead. "Hey Kiri-chan, there's a hair accessory stall over here. Want me to pick you up a ribbon?" Kirito groaned again, but this time, he couldn't hold back the small smile tugging at his lip. It was ridiculous, all of it, but somehow, being surrounded by his friends, made it bearable. Asuna leaned closer, her voice low and teasing. "A ribbon might not be such a bad idea." Kirito shot her a mock glare. "You're supposed to be the reasonable one." She just laughed, the sound light and musical. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Kirito found himself laughing too. Maybe this new reality wasn't so bad after all. As the day gave way to evening, Alni's central plaza came alive with its usual hustle and bustle. The glow of lanterns illuminated the cobbled streets, casting a warm, golden light over the city. Street performers played cheerful melodies on makeshift instruments, while NPC vendors called out their wares to passing players. The air buzzed with the hum of conversation and the occasional sound of laughter. The group had settled into their usual spot at a cafe just off the plaza, tucked away from the busiest streets, but still close enough to feel the energy of the city. Their table was overflowing with virtual delicacies Jill had ordered. The plates laden with roasted meats, stews, fresh bread, and even a tower of colorful desserts that Klein had insisted they needed. "So, what's next?" Klein asked, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied groan after finishing his second helping of stew. He propped his feet up on another chair, earning a disapproving glance from Asuna. "We've beaten the rogue eye, saved the game, and turned Kirito into Asuna's twin. What's left to do?" Kirito sighed, setting down his fork and giving Klein a flat look. "Do you have to keep bringing that up?" "Of course I do," Klein replied with a grin. It's not every day you get front row seat to something this hilarious. I mean, come on, Kiri-chan, you've got to admit." "I don't," Kirito interrupted firmly, though the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "Give it a rest, Klein," Asuna said, though she was smiling too. She reached for her glass of tea, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "I think Kirito's been a good sport about it so far." Klein held up his hands in mock surrender. Fine. No more twin jokes, for now." Sinon, who had been quietly sipping her drink, raised an eyebrow. "I give it 5 minutes," she said dryly. "You won't me, Sinon," Klein said, clutching his chest dramatically. "Good," she shot back, smirking. Asuna chuckled and turned her attention back to the table. "Anyway, Klein does have a point," she said, her voice thoughtful. "What is next? There's still so much of this world we haven't seen. We could explore the floating islands again. Or maybe try to find that hidden city Klein keeps insisting exists." "It does exist," Klein protested, sitting up straight. "I read about it on the forums. They say it's tucked away in the mountains, and you have to solve a series of riddles to even find the entrance." Sinon snorted softly. "Sounds like someone fell for another wild goose chase." "It's not a goose chase," Klein shot back, his face reddening slightly. "Just because you don't have an adventurous spirit doesn't mean it's not real." "I have an adventurous spirit," Sinon replied, her tone calm but cutting. "I just don't waste my time chasing fairy tales." Okay, Jill said, stepping in before Klein could fire back. He leaned forward, his massive arms resting on the table as he grinned. "Let's say the hidden city is real. What's supposed to be there, Klein? Treasure, rare gear, or just bragging rights?" "All of the above," Klein said confidently, crossing his arms. "But mostly treasure. Epic-level treasure." Kirito leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with quiet amusement. He rested his elbow on the arm of the chair and propped his chin on his hand, feeling a rare sense of ease. The banter was familiar, comforting even. "Honestly," Asuna said, glancing at Kirito, "I wouldn't mind exploring the floating islands again. There's still so much we didn't get to see last time." Kirito nodded. "That's true. And I'm pretty sure we missed at least one dungeon." "You're both thinking too small," Klein said, shaking his head. "We've got a whole world out there to explore, and you want to go back to the same islands." Asuna raised an eyebrow. "Says the guy who's been trying to find the same city for weeks." "That's different," Klein said, pointing at her. "The city is legendary. The islands are just islands." Sinon sighed, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. "I'm with Asuna on this one. The islands are beautiful, and at least we know they exist." "Thank you," Asuna said, smiling. Agil chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "Either way, I think we've earned a little downtime before diving into the next big adventure. Not that I mind chasing treasure, but a man's gotta relax every now and then." "Downtime sounds good," Kirito admitted, though there was a small part of him that already felt restless at the thought of staying still for too long. Klein turned to him, his grin widening. "Come on, Kiri-chan. Don't tell me you're turning into a homebody. Where's your sense of adventure?" Kirito gave him a pointed look. "I think I've had enough adventure for a while. Thanks. Besides, as long as it doesn't involve rogue AIs, I'm in?" "Agreed," Asuna said with a nod. "One rogue AI is more than enough for a lifetime." Klein smirked. "Oh. No promises. You never know what's lurking out there. Maybe the next big threat is already waiting for us in some dark corner of the map." Kirito rolled his eyes. "That's exactly what I don't want to hear." The group laughed, the sound blending into the lively chatter of the cafe around them. For a moment, Kirito allowed himself to relax, leaning back in his chair as he took in the scene. Agil was pouring himself another drink. Klein was already reaching for another plate of food. Asuna was smiling warmly at him, and Sinon, though quiet, was watching the group with a faint, contented smile of her own. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was enough. Kirito let out a small breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His body still didn't feel entirely like his own, and the lingering discomfort of his transformation gnawed at the back of his mind. But here, surrounded by his friends, the weight of it all didn't feel as heavy. "Whatever's next," Kirito said after a moment, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "As long as we're all together, I'm in." Azuna's smile widened, and Klein raised his cup in a mock toast. "That's the spirit. To new adventure." "To new adventures," Agil echoed, his deep voice steady. Sinon rolled her eyes, but raised her glass as well. "And hopefully fewer idiots," she muttered, though the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Kirito chuckled softly, raising his glass along with the rest of them. "And no more rogue AIs," he added pointedly. The group burst into laughter again, the sound filling the warm evening air. And for the first time in a long while, Kirito felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they could face them together. The streets of Alne were quiet as Kirito and Asuna made their way back to their cabin. The earlier bustle of the city had faded, leaving behind a peaceful calm. Lanterns lined the cobbled streets, their soft glow casting warm pools of light that danced on the stone. Above them, the stars stretched endlessly across the night sky, their brilliance undimmed by the faint silver glow of the moon. Kirito walked with his hands in his pockets, his gaze drifting upward to the constellations. He could hear the faint hum of the city still alive in the distance, the occasional murmur of voices, the soft clinking of dishes from a nearby tavern closing for the night. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the gardens that dotted the city. Asuna walked beside him, her footsteps light and quiet. She glanced over at him, her warm brown eyes catching the faint glow of the lanterns. For a while, neither of them spoke, content to walk in companionable silence. The sound of their boots on the cobblestones, the only noise between them. Finally, Asuna broke the quiet. "You're really okay, aren't you?" Her voice was soft, but there was a note of curiosity in it, as if she were searching for something deeper beneath his calm demeanor. Kirito glanced at her, her question pulling him out of his thought. He considered it for a moment, the weight of the day settling over him. The teasing, the laughter, the moments of lightness. None of it had erased the strangeness of his situation, but somehow it didn't feel as overwhelming anymore. "Yeah," he said, after a pause, his voice steady. "I think I am." Asuna smiled at his answer, her expression tender and relieved. Her hand brushed against his as they walked, and after a moment of hesitation, she reached out and took it. Her fingers were warm, her grip gentle but firm. "Good," she said, her voice brimming with quiet conviction. "Because no matter what you look like, you're still my Kirito." Kirito felt heat rise to his cheeks at her words, a faint blush spreading across his face. He looked away, embarrassed, but unable to hide the small genuine smile tugging at his lips. He tightened his grip on her hand, holding it a little closer. "Thanks, Asuna," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The two of them continued walking, the cabin coming into view at the edge of the city. It sat nestled against a grove of trees, its simple wooden frame bathed in moonlight. The soft chirping of crickets filled the air, blending with the rustling of leaves and the gentle breeze. As they approached the door, Asuna slowed her pace, her expression shifting. There was a playful glint in her eyes now, the corners of her mouth curving into a mischievous smile. "Although," she said, her tone teasing. Kirito glanced at her warily, his brows furrowing. "Although what?" She tilted her head, her hair catching the light as she gave him a mock thoughtful look. "I still think you'd look cute with a braid." Kirito groaned, pulling his hand out of hers to cover his face. "Not this again," he muttered, his voice muffled behind his palm. Asuna laughed, the sound light and musical, filling the quiet night air. She stepped past him, reaching for the door. "I'm just saying," she continued, glancing back at him with a grin as she pushed the door open. "It would suit you." Kirito shook his head, following her inside. "Good night, Asuna," he said firmly, his tone carrying a mix of exasperation and fondness. Asuna laughed again, stepping into the cabin and letting the door swing closed behind them. Outside, the city of Aon lay quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of the lanterns and the silvery light of the stars. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint promise of new adventures yet to come. And within the cozy warmth of the cabin, two players, bound by love, friendship, and the trials they had faced together, prepared to face whatever challenges the world might throw their way, one step at a time.